But we begin tonight with a developing story on threats made against Democratic Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. Law enforcement officials telling NBC News tonight that the FBI has arrested a Northern California man, a San Francisco man, for making multiple threatening phone calls to Speaker Pelosi and to her husband. Federal officials say the man made dozens of phone calls to Speaker Pelosi's home in California, to her home in Washington, D.C., and to her husband's business office. The charges remain under seal, but a federal official tells NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams that the man will be charged with violating a federal law against making calls that annoy, abuse, threaten, or harass. It's a charge that carries a maximum 2-year prison sentence. According to this official who spoke with NBC, the calls were so numerous, the decision was made that something had to be done. The Associated Press also quoting unnamed federal officials tonight as saying that in the threatening calls, the man recited Speaker Pelosi's home address and said that if she ever wanted to see her home again, she would stop health reform. This arrest, of course, comes within 24 hours of yesterday's FBI arrest of a Washington state man who was accused of making threats against Democratic Senator Patty Murray. Both of these stories are still developing tonight. We will let you know about any further details as we get them. Now, the other big story in politics today happened in the middle of the country, in Minnesota, when the myth of the moderate Republican, the modern moderate Republican, finally came to an end.
Freedom-loving Minnesotans, please welcome Congresswoman Michele Bachmann and Governor Sarah Palin.
Today, alongside Sarah Palin and Michele Bachmann in Minnesota, stood Minnesota Governor and 2012 presidential hopeful Tim Pawlenty. Yeah, there he is. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, same event. That's him. Introducing Sarah Palin and Michele Bachmann today. Mr. Pawlenty not only appearing with Ms. Bachmann and Ms. Palin today, but blast emailing his supporters in advance of today's event, telling them that they need to stand with Michele Bachmann to help send her back to Washington. Here's the deal. Tim Pawlenty still gets described as a voice of reason in the Republican Party, a voice of moderation in a party that is increasingly leaning toward the very, very far right. You can either be a moderate, you can represent the center, you can be the reasonable alternative to the far right, or you can hitch your wagon to Michele Bachmann. You can't be both. Trust me.
Thomas Jefferson said, a revolution every now and then is a good thing. We are at the point, Sean, of revolution.
I'm really now in Washington. I'm a foreign correspondent on enemy lines. I want people in Minnesota armed and dangerous.
That is who Tim Pawlenty is now urging his supporters to get behind. If Tim Pawlenty is the voice of moderation in the Republican Party, it's possible the Beltway media needs to find a new guy in the Republican Party to call the voice of moderation. And they have, actually.
Republican Bob McDonnell has focused not on the president, but on taxes and jobs in a campaign targeted squarely at moderates.
Private sector solutions and free enterprise and limited government.
Mr. McDonnell has done his best to rebrand himself as a moderate willing to work with Democrats. During his campaign, Mr. McDonnell ran as a moderate. Mr. McDonnell ran as a moderate conservative. All quotes from the coverage of Bob McDonnell's campaign for the governorship in Virginia and the way that he has governed since he has been there. Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, after Tim Pawlenty, now being christened the new voice of the Republican moderate. When the Richmond Times-Dispatch endorsed Mr. McDonnell last year, they noted his, quote, moderate temperament. Mr. McDonnell was handpicked by the Republican Party to give the Republican response to President Obama's State of the Union address earlier this year, after he had been in office precisely 11 days. Mr. McDonnell was praised widely at that time as the moderate-seeming new face of the Republican Party. Move over, Tim Pawlenty. There is a new Republican moderate-seeming guy in town. A new Republican moderate-seeming guy who just declared that the month of April will be Confederate History Month in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Governor McDonnell releasing a proclamation to that effect, saying, quote, April is the month in which the people of Virginia joined the Confederate States of America in a 4-year war between the states for independence. Well, that's what we're calling it now. A 4-year war between the states for independence. Sounds awesome. Is that all it was for? Proclamation goes on, whereas Virginia has long recognized her Confederate history, the numerous Civil War battlefields that mark every region of the state, the leaders and individuals in the Army, Navy, and at home who fought for their homes and communities and Commonwealth in a time very different than ours today. And whereas it is important for all Virginians to reflect upon our Commonwealth's shared history, to understand the sacrifices of the Confederate leaders, soldiers, and citizens during the period of the Civil War. Do you notice anything missing here in all the whereases? In this call to remember the Confederate soldiers fighting, for their homes and communities in the War of Independence? Do you notice the lack of mention of something else the Confederacy might have been fighting for? The last time a Republican governor in Virginia tried to celebrate a Confederate History Month in Virginia, he at least had the decency to mention slavery. Governor Jim Gilmore included this in his 1999 Confederacy Proclamation, quote, "Our recognition of Confederate history also recognizes that slavery was one of the causes of the war. Slavery is abhorred and condemned by Virginians and was ended by this war." Right. This time around, Governor McDonnell cut that part out, made no mention of slavery at all. Criticized for that, the new moderate-seeming face of the Republican Party said that he did not think slavery was an important enough issue to include in a proclamation on the Confederacy. He told the Washington Post, quote, "There were any number of aspects to that conflict between the states. Obviously, it involved slavery. It involved other issues. But I focused on the ones I thought were most significant for Virginia." See, slavery just wasn't significant enough to mention. The Civil War, any number of things going on there. Slavery, whatever. A spokesman for Governor McDonnell later had to clarify that comment, telling the website Talking Points Memo today, quote, "The governor knows that slavery is a significant part of Virginia's history." Turns out that clarification was not quite good enough, because even later today, Governor McDonnell finally caved on the whole, the Civil War was about any number of things, slavery, schmavery, let's commemorate the Confederacy scandal. Governor McDonnell finally tonight forced to reverse himself on the matter and to issue an apology. He put out a statement that said, quote, "The proclamation issued by this office designating April as Confederate History Month contained a major omission. The failure to include any reference to slavery was a mistake, and for that I apologize to any fellow Virginian who has been offended or disappointed." Along with this apology came an update to the official Confederate History Month proclamation, which, of course, is still in effect. The update reads, quote, "Whereas it is important for all Virginians to understand that the institution of slavery led to this war and was an evil and inhumane practice that deprived people of their God-given inalienable rights, and all Virginians are thankful for its permanent eradication from our borders." Governor Bob McDonnell of Virginia was supposed to be the new face of Republican moderation. He says his Celebrate the Confederacy proclamation was, in the first instance, a way of encouraging tourism to the Commonwealth of Virginia. Well, between the Celebrate the Confederacy, slavery, schmavery proclamation and the fact that Governor McDonnell's Attorney General is scheduled to be speaking at an event at the state capitol on Monday to promote the open carrying of loaded firearms, I'm sure that tourists everywhere feel very, very welcome in Virginia these days. Joining us now is Melissa Harris-Lacewell, an MSNBC contributor and professor of politics and African American studies, whereas at Princeton University. Melissa, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Well, and probably more important, the child of Virginia. I went to public school from kindergarten through high school in the state of Virginia, so I know quite a bit about this war of northern aggression that the governor is speaking about.
Well, as an African American studies professor and as a Virginia native, before we even talk about Bob McDonnell, what do you think about the idea of there being Confederate History Month in Virginia?
Well, certainly it's not as though Governor McDonnell initiated this, but he did revive it. So, again, I know enough about Virginia history to know that there really are sort of two different ways that Virginia has thought about its southern past. And one is kind of the Thomas Jefferson notion of Virginia history. And obviously the Thomas Jefferson notion of Virginia history includes slavery. There'd be no way to talk about Jefferson without talking about slavery. But it is a tradition that is focused primarily on how Virginia contributed to the founding of the nation, how someone who was himself a slaveholder wrote a document that wasn't a slave document, but a free document, right? The Declaration of Independence, saying that we have inalienable rights, and that helped to create the Union. But then there's this other way that Virginia history is sometimes presented in the schools and on Monument Avenue in Richmond and on Jefferson Davis Highway where I grew up. And that is a history that says what Virginia is primarily is the site of massive resistance against the Union, that it is the site where sort of brave soldiers came together to fight against this very thing that Jefferson had sacrificed to create. So in both cases,